Musician Who Played My Heart Part 2, The Silence Between Us. The truth, like a sudden, dissonant chord, has brought their composition to a crashing halt. Julian Thorne, betrayed and wounded, stands on the ruins of his trust, his long-held hatred of the aristocracy reaffirmed by the one woman who broke through his armor. Lady Evelina Harcourt, stripped of her disguise, faces not only the judgment of her beloved conductor, but the devastating certainty of her return to the gilded prison she fled. The music is silent. In this agonizing second movement, one must ask, can a love forged in forbidden fire survive the unforgiving frost of social reality? Prepare for a chapter of dramatic confrontation, raw confession, and the heartbreak of separation. Chapter 4, The Mask Cracks. The journey away from Bath was silent, taut with unspoken accusation and fear. Eva sat huddled in the corner of the carriage, the frantic whisper of Lady Beatrice's recognition still echoing in her mind. Julian Thorne did not speak to her during the cramped hours of travel. He merely sat opposite, his brooding presence a heavy weight, his intense gaze rarely leaving her face. He was waiting, and Eva knew that the moment they reached their temporary lodgings, her carefully constructed world of Eva Hart would collapse. They stopped in a small, industrial market town, a dreary, smoke-stained place that felt 1,000,000 miles from the elegant ballrooms of her youth. Julian, without a word, guided her away from the rest of the troupe toward a secluded, damp parlor in the lodging house, shutting the door firmly behind them. The moment the latch clicked, the dam broke. "Who are you?" Julian's voice was low and dangerous, stripped of all musical metaphor. He did not shout. His fury was a cold, quiet storm, far more terrifying than any loud outburst. "I asked you for the truth, and I saved you from exposure tonight. Yet you stand there, silent, radiating the fear of a woman who knows she is running out of time." Eva finally met his gaze, and the profound depth of his anger and disappointment hit her with the force of a physical blow. She saw not just the conductor demanding answers, but the man whose trust she had silently courted and was now on the verge of shattering. "I am a musician," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You are a liar," he countered, taking a single intimidating step toward her. "Your hands are smooth. Your fear is the fear of losing a fortune, not a meal. And when that woman looked at you, she didn't see an ordinary violinist. She saw Lady Evelina Harcourt." The name, spoken by his rough, beloved voice, hung in the air like a death sentence. Eva's composure, the poise Lady Beatrice had so scorned, finally deserted her. She lowered her head, the shame a bitter flood. "Yes," she whispered, the admission a sound of profound defeat. "It is my name." Julian Thorne went utterly still. The silence that followed was suffocating, punctuated only by the frantic beat of Eva's heart. When he spoke again, his voice was laced with a chilling, triumphant bitterness. "Lady Evelina Harcourt," he repeated, savoring the syllables as if they tasted of ash. "The Duke's daughter, a woman born to sit in the boxes and pass judgment. You did not run from your life, you merely put on a costume to mock ours." He was furious, yes, but beneath the fury, Eva heard a profound, wrenching betrayal. "No, that is not true," she cried, finally looking up, tears welling in her eyes. "I ran because I was suffocating. I was to be married to a man, Lord Harrington, who saw me as nothing more than a convenient accessory, a pretty, lifeless doll." She stepped forward, reaching out a hand, pleading for him to understand. "My father was arranging my life, suffocating my spirit, and I couldn't bear it. I cut my hair, I took my violin, and I fled. I came here because this is the only world where I have ever felt real, where I am judged only by the music I make." Her voice cracked with emotion. "I swear to you, Julian, I never intended to mock you or your art. I simply sought freedom. I sought authenticity. And I sought it here, among you, because you were the only person who heard my true voice, even when it was hidden behind a different name." Julian stood firm, his expression now one of devastating, cold finality. The look of profound disappointment in his eyes was the most painful thing Eve had ever witnessed. "And yet, you lied," he said, the word cutting deeper than a knife. "You lied to the people who trust me. You lied to Mrs. Linton, who worries over your soft hands. And you lied to me. You let me speak of my hatred for your world, knowing you belong to it. You let me fall for a woman who is the living embodiment of the class that despises everything I am." He turned away, running a frustrated hand through his dark, unruly hair. "Do you think this is a game, Lady Evelina? That you can play the pauper for a season and then return to your duke, amused by the memory of the common conductor you toyed with. It was never a game, Eva insisted, moving to stand beside him, desperate to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. I love the music here, and I love you. It is not the title I love, Julian, it is the man, the artist, the truth that lives inside you. Her confession hung raw and vulnerable in the small, dusty room, a moment of profound, painful honesty. Julian flinched as if struck. The love she had declared only fueled his rage and self-loathing. He spun back to face her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of betrayal and an undeniable, scorching desire. Do not sully that word, he ground out, taking her shoulders in a grip that was almost painful. You love the idea of me, the raw drama of the forbidden. But you are a Harcourt, and I am Julian Thorne, a man born of the streets. Our love is impossible. It is a discord that will ruin us both. He released her abruptly, his hands dropping as if scorched. Your very presence here is a constant, screaming lie that shames the integrity of this company and mocks the pain of my past. I should have known no good could come from a woman whose hands have never known labor. He walked to the door, his shoulders set in a line of harsh, painful resolve. He didn't look back. Pack your things, Lady Evelina, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. The music that bound us is silent now. I will not have a duchess's daughter among my common musicians. You are dismissed. Eva stood paralyzed, the world tilting beneath her feet. The words, "You are dismissed," were not just an end to her employment. They were the execution of the only true self she had ever known. She watched the door close behind him, listening to the heavy, agonizing silence he left in his wake. Her confession, meant to be her liberation, had only resulted in her final, crushing dismissal. Julian Thorne had seen her truth, loved her music, and yet in the end her noble blood had been the poison that killed their song. She picked up her violin case, the last remnant of her freedom, and fled the small parlor, tears finally streaming down her face. No longer Eva Hart, the aspiring musician, but the devastated, exposed Lady Evelina Harcourt.
You truly broke my heart!
I know I did.
Chapter 5. The Silence Between Us. The return to London was a journey made in the cold, desolate landscape of defeat. Lady Evelina Harcourt was back, yet the woman who stepped from the hired carriage and into the cavernous, echoing hall of the Duke of Berwick's mansion was an empty vessel. The ice-blue silk gowns and the diamond rings felt alien and heavy, a masquerade of a life she no longer wished to claim. The Duke, relieved and furious in equal measure, saw only the scandal she had averted. Lord Harrington, the frigid suitor, was quickly recalled to cement the betrothal, his cold, condescending pity only deepening Evelina's despair. She was trapped, returned to her gilded prison with an irrevocability that mocked her brief, reckless flight. Evelina resumed her old duties, the polite calls, the forced smiles, the endless, meaningless drawing-room conversations. But her soul ached with a profound, relentless yearning. Her afternoons, once filled with the earthy camaraderie of the orchestra and the electric tension of Julian's gaze, were now characterized by a silence that was deafening. She sat at her grand, polished pianoforte, her fingers attempting the elegant notes of a Schubert sonata, but the music was hollow. Her mind, her heart, her very being craved the raw, untamed melodies of Julian's world. She missed the squeak of the cheap fiddle, the smell of rosin and damp wood, the rough, collective breath of musicians working for the simple, honest beauty of their art. Above all, she missed the man who had seen her truth. She had fled her class to find a life, only to find love in the most forbidden of places, and then to lose both simultaneously. The truth of her noble birth had felt less like a fact and more like a terminal illness that had destroyed the one chance she had at happiness. Meanwhile, miles away in the industrial northern towns, Julian Thorne's orchestra began to crumble. Julian, driven by a furious pride, refused to acknowledge the gaping hole Eva Hart had left. He tried to continue the rehearsals, to complete the iron and the silk, the symphony that had been woven from their shared glances and late-night confessions. But the music was stagnant. The intricate counterpoint he had composed specifically for her violin lay lifeless on the page. He would raise his baton, and the orchestra would begin, but the vital spark was gone. The raw, beautiful honesty that Eva's playing had awakened in the ensemble had vanished. The other musicians noticed the change. The conductor, who had once been relentlessly challenging, was now merely withdrawn and desperately unhappy. He drove himself with a punishing discipline, but his intensity had curdled into a cold, destructive fury. Every melody reminded him of her. The high, pure notes of the second violin line were her voice. The dramatic, heart-stopping swells of emotion were the echo of her tearful confession. He hated her for the lie, but his hatred was merely a thin shield over a searing, agonizing love. He was caught between his bitter, lifelong prejudice against the aristocracy and the undeniable, soul-deep connection he had shared with Lady Evelina Harcourt. He couldn't finish the symphony because without her silk to soften his iron, the music lacked redemption. It was merely rage. One late, sleepless night, Julian sat alone in his lodgings, staring at the unfinished score, his hands clenched into fists. He had sent her away to protect his wounded pride, but in doing so, he had silenced his art. He realized with crushing clarity that her class meant nothing to the honesty of her music, and that the only one wearing a blindfold of prejudice was him. A few weeks later, an announcement appeared in the London papers, a splash of color in Evelina's gray existence. Julian Thorne's orchestra was scheduled to debut its new work, The Iron and the Silk, at the prestigious Royal Opera House. The event was a grand, noble gala, an evening celebrating high society's patronage of the arts, sponsored with bitter irony by the Harcourt family themselves. The debut had been a surprise, arranged in Julian's absence by his pragmatic manager, who saw the opportunity for the orchestra's social elevation. Julian, too driven to admit defeat and too proud to cancel, had agreed to perform the piece, even unfinished. Evelina, sitting in her father's dining room, read the notice and felt a tremor run through her. He was here, he was near, and he was about to play their song. The night of the gala arrived, and Evelina, a pale, exquisite statue beside her oblivious fiancé, took her seat in the Duke of Berwick's private box. She wore a dark velvet gown, her shortened hair now curled stylishly, a final necessary concession to society. As Julian Thorne walked onto the conductor's stage, dressed formally for the occasion, the vast, glittering audience erupted in applause. Evelina watched him, her hand pressed against her chest where the small hidden chain with Harrington's ring lay. Julian looked utterly magnificent and utterly miserable. He seemed taller, thinner, his face etched with a deeper severity. Their eyes did not meet. He did not look toward the boxes, his focus already consumed by the music. He raised his baton. The symphony began. It was magnificent, a fierce, visceral work that painted a vivid tapestry of pain, longing, and conflict. The iron was there in the driving, relentless rhythm of the brass and percussion, a sound of struggle and defiance. But as the piece moved into the passages where Eva's violin should have sung the silk, Julian's baton became halting. He conducted the rest of the orchestra with his eyes closed, his whole body tense with aching devotion. The part written for her, the sublime, soaring melody that represented the hope of their connection and her genuine spirit, was played by a competent, anonymous musician. But the melody, without Eva's unique truth, was just a sketch. It lacked the life, the breath, the vulnerability that she had given it. Julian brought the symphony to a close, not with the triumphant swell of the intended ending, but with a sudden, devastating stop, a deliberate silence where the final, resolving notes should have been. The work was unfinished. He had ended their song in a quiet moment of musical despair, unable to write the future without her. The audience, sensing the strange, incomplete beauty, applauded politely. But Evelina, trembling in the box, felt the omission like a punch to the gut. The silence was not just a gap in the score. It was the echoing sound of his heartbreak, the confession of his own profound, undeniable loss. He had performed the song of their love and loss, unaware that the very woman who had inspired his most passionate work sat in the audience, already undone by the sound of the silence between them. Chapter 6, The Musician Who Played My Heart. The silence after the final, incomplete note of the iron and the silk stretched, profound and aching, across the Royal Opera House. The polite applause of the noble audience was a thin, insufficient sound attempting to bridge the canyon of heartbreak Julian Thorne had just created. Julian, standing on the podium, his back ramrod straight, felt a crushing emptiness. He had poured every ounce of his fury, his betrayal, and his agonizing love into the symphony, only to find himself stopped by the very lack of her. The incomplete ending was his public confession. He could not finish the music without the woman he had sent away. He lowered his baton, his shoulders slumping infinitesimally under the weight of his defeat. In the Duke's box, Evelina rose. Lord Harrington reached out a proprietary hand to restrain her, whispering, "Evelina, sit down. The moment is past." But the moment was not past. It was imminent. The music had spoken the truth, and now it demanded action. She saw the despair etched into Julian's profile, the sorrow in the abrupt, broken ending of their song, and she knew he had chosen integrity over pride. With a conviction she had never before possessed in her life as Lady Evelina Harcourt, she moved. She cast a single, withering glance at Harrington, stripping him of any authority over her, and then walked past her stunned father. She left the gilded safety of the box, traversing the short, public distance with a singular, unstoppable purpose. The audience, accustomed to the elegant, glacial composure of the Duke's daughter, watched in bewildered silence as the exquisite Lady Evelina descended the steps toward the stage. Julian was turning to face the applause, his expression bleak, when a movement caught his eye. His breath caught in his throat. Standing at the foot of the stage, her shortened hair catching the light, her eyes shining with the raw truth he had seen in her music, was Eva Hart. Evelina's gaze locked onto his. The vast hall, the thousands of witnesses, the chasm of class that separated them, all of it dissolved. There was only the unfinished music and the undeniable connection between them. With a grace that was both regal and entirely authentic, she stepped onto the stage, walking toward him. The collective gasp of London society was audible. She stopped mere feet from Julian, her hands outstretched in an offering. "You cannot finish it alone, Julian," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the silence of the hall. "The silk belongs with the iron." From a member of the orchestra, the anonymous violinist who had tried to play her part, Evelina swiftly retrieved her borrowed violin and bow. She tucked the instrument beneath her chin, her movements precise and practiced, entirely the musician and not the noblewoman. Julian stared at her, shock and agonizing hope warring in his eyes. He saw the fire he had demanded, the spirit Lady Beatrice had claimed she lacked. He saw the only woman who had ever truly seen him. He raised his baton once more, his hand trembling slightly. He looked at the sheet music, then dismissed it, conducting now only from memory and from the heart. He gave her the downbeat. And then she played. Evelina did not play the polite, technically flawless notes of her former life. She played the final resolute silk passage, the melody of love, honesty, and liberation, with a raw, aching devotion. It was the sound of a heart freed from its cage, a declaration of identity woven into sound. Julian, overcome, dropped the baton onto the stand. He abandoned the role of conductor and reached for the nearest instrument, a lone viola, and joined her. They were no longer the conductor and the musician. They were two artists, two lovers, weaving the resolving, triumphant notes of their own finale. Their duet was transcendent. It was the passion of the streets blending with the poetry of the salon, a perfect harmony that transcended titles and poverty. The sound soared through the opera house, a love letter written in sound, bringing not just the audience, but Julian himself to the brink of tears. When the final chord faded, resolved and glorious, the silence that followed was not one of awkwardness, but of profound emotional catharsis. Then the entire audience, Duke, Dowager, and common man alike, rose in a spontaneous, thunderous standing ovation. Before all of London, before the father who had dictated her life and the man who had seen her soul, Evelina stepped away from her instrument. She turned to face the gasping, mesmerized crowd. "My name is Lady Evelina Harcourt," she declared, her voice ringing with finality. "But I am a violinist, and no title, no class, no rule can define the heart. The only life worth living is one lived in truth." She turned back to Julian, who was now standing, his eyes wet with emotion, the fierce love he had suppressed for weeks now visible on his face. "I am Eva Hart," she said to him, her eyes shining. "And this," she gestured to the violin, then to the man she loved, "is my home." Julian closed the final distance between them. The rigid, self-protective pride he had worn like armor finally shattered. "I was a fool," he murmured, his voice thick, reaching up to gently touch her face, his calloused fingers a stark contrast to her soft skin. I swore I would never be dictated by the prejudice of your class, and yet I allowed the prejudice of my own past to dictate my heart. Forgive me, Eva. He offered her not a ring of cold diamond, but his hand, a common conductor's rough, honest hand. I can offer you a life of challenge, of toil, of ceaseless travel, and relentless art, Julian said, his eyes burning with an intense promise. But I offer you music, honesty, and a love that is bound not by paper or privilege, but by fire and truth. Evelina took his hand, fitting her own perfectly to his. Then that is the only life I desire. Their kiss on the stage before the whole of London society was not the demure peck of a noble engagement, but the raw, urgent reunion of two souls who had been torn apart and finally found their way back to the only symphony that mattered, the song of their forever. Their song ended not in silence, but in a triumphant, unforgettable symphony.
My love, my life, my destiny, together we stand.
And so the final, soaring movement of their symphony comes to a close. Evelina and Julian proved that true love is not about the title you inherit, but the courage you possess. They taught us that the most beautiful melodies are often born from the greatest conflict. Their song, once fragile and forbidden, has finally resolved into a triumphant, unforgettable chord. Thank you for listening to The Musician Who Played My Heart. Did Julian's fury break your heart? Did Evelina's final defiance steal your breath? We absolutely loved bringing this sweeping, emotional romance to life. If you were swept away by the drama, the passion, and the power of their music, please don't forget to like this story, subscribe for more historical romance that will steal your breath, and comment below with your favorite moment from their unforgettable duet. We read everyone.